March 25th, 1985. It's Monday morning, and Cecil King has a problem on his hands. He's been trying to reach his daughter-in-law, Mona King. But Mona hasn't returned any of his calls.
He had been unable to reach his daughter-in-law by telephone, so he just came over to check the welfare.
Cecil's concern only grows when his daughter-in-law doesn't answer the door.
He couldn't see anything looking through windows, so he then went around to the back part of the house, looked through windows.
Finally, Cecil's eyes land on a shocking sight. A woman's body, motionless, on the kitchen floor.
So he went to another residence and called 911.
Not far away, Lt.Joe Kenda and his team are already hard at work.
I was sitting in my office with an entire team of detectives. We're going over a murder.
That's no problem. We're just going over the Rivera case. I think we have McNair go back out in the neighborhood, recanvass.
The phone call comes from the comm center that there's another murder.
It's Kenda.
So you hang up the phone, you look at everybody and say, well, this now moves to page 2. We have a new page 1. Let's go. When we get there, there's the usual activity going on. The neighbors are all out in the street trying to see what's going on.
What do we got?
The officer tells Kenda they found not one, but 2 bodies inside.
So our complainant comes around here. He looks through this window and sees her laying here.
In the kitchen is a female. She has multiple gunshot wounds to the head and chest.
How many bullet wounds?
I counted 5.
So whoever did this really wanted her dead.
Yeah, it looks that way.
Right away, Kenda spots a clue on the tile floor.
There are bloody shoe prints found near the body. The heel is rounded and then squared off at the front because it's an elevated heel. And the sole print is almost triangular, pointed on all sides. It's from a cowboy boot. A footprint from a cowboy boot is very different than you would see from any other kind of shoe. They belong to our shooter.
Kenda moves on to the living room to examine victim number 2.
She also has multiple gunshot wounds of the chest and head.
How many bullet wounds?
Total 7 in the front and in the rear.
Well, when you see somebody's been shot that many times, you know whoever was the shooter was a very angry person.
What do you estimate the time of death was?
I put it between 1:30 p.m. and 8:30 p.m.
She has a purse over her left arm. There's a jacket in her right hand. And her keys are a few inches away from her hand. Is she coming home? Is she preparing to leave home? The position of the body would indicate coming in because her feet are toward the door and her head is toward the interior of the home.
These are the victims.
Yes, sir. Cecil King identified the bodies.
The body in the living room is Mona King, the owner of the house. In the kitchen is her sister, Carla Cannon.
It is unusual for multiple members of a family to be murdered at the same time. I've experienced it before, but it's not common.
Investigators scour the house for physical evidence. and quickly strike gold.
Just inside the doorway from the kitchen and living room is a stereo console. There are casings in a little pile. Because of the number of them, a total of 12, it would indicate 2 guns.
Could 2 guns mean 2 shooters? Perhaps. But Kenda thinks it's more likely it was one shooter who came prepared.
He's not just a killer, he's a determined killer.
The fact that the casings are all in one place gives Kenda insight into the type of guns used.
If a semi-automatic pistol is used, the casing is ejected when the shot is fired. They can be thrown quite a distance. They're not going to be in a little pile on top of a stereo console.
These were unloaded by hand from 2 revolvers. And what's particularly unusual, the casings are .22s.
A revolver in that caliber is not a common weapon. They were common in the 50s and 60s. They stopped making them when semi-automatic pistols came into play. So the revolvers are unusual.
Could the shooter have been a burglar who broke in, only to discover there were 2 witnesses home?
There's no forced entry to the doors. There's cash on the counters in some of the bedrooms. There's valuables everywhere that are untouched. There are none of the indicative signs of burglary and theft in this house. So the odds are, at this point, the only purpose for this entry is to kill these people.
Not sure what make and model.
I don't know.
Detectives question the neighbors, looking for anything out of the ordinary.
Most of these people know what neighbors tend to know, which is nothing. But we do find one neighbor who says that she remembers on Sunday she saw a white van parked at the house.
But one neighbor claims to have seen a different vehicle parked near Mona King's house the day of the murders.
She says she sees a blue pickup truck sitting in the driveway.
Kenda's new mission is to identify the drivers of these suspicious vehicles.
If you can find out who was in those vehicles, you can at least lock them into being at the crime scene at some point close to the time of death.
Thankfully, another witness has come forward.
Lieutenant,
One who may have additional information about the shooting.
this is Wayne Lewis.
I'm Detective Kenda.
Hi. Is it true about Mona and Carla being dead?
Unfortunately, it is. Did you know them?
Yeah. We're just really good friends.
Can you think of anyone that might want to harm either one of them?
No.
As Kenda listens, he realizes Wayne Lewis is more of a concerned friend than a credible witness.
Well, if you can think of anything at all, doesn't matter how small it is, make sure you give me a call. Thank you.
Kenda returns to the question at hand. Who would want to murder both of these sisters?
In all of these kinds of cases where multiple deaths occur, it is unusual and often unlikely that each victim is an intended victim. More often than not, one is the intended target, the other is collateral damage.
So which sister was the intended target? Kenda questions the man who discovered the bodies, Mona King's father-in-law, Cecil.
Cecil,
Yeah,
I'm very sorry for your loss.
thank you.
I know this is very difficult for you, but I need to ask you a few questions.
Okay.
Kenda starts by asking Cecil about Mona's house guest.
What can you tell me about Carla?
She's divorced, and she's been living with Ray and Mona until she figures out what to do next.
Prior to the divorce, 38-year-old Carla Cannon was a stay-at-home mom.
Carla is a receptionist at a local hospital which specializes in psychiatry.
They describe Carla as more of an outgoing type person, more so than Mona.
Carla was protective of her little sister.
Can you tell me a little bit about Mona?
Devoted mother, wife.
36-year-old Mona King, a former homecoming queen, had a career in real estate.
Mona was a staff appraiser at Otero Savings and Loan. She was sweet, helpful, and a lovely person. I can't say enough nice things about Mona.
Mona is the blouse buttoned to the neck, loose blue jean, church-going lady.
Mona is married to Cecil's son, Raymond King.
Cecil says they've been married for 7 years. They've had some recent difficulties. They've been separated for several weeks.
You begin to wonder, well, what happened here? Where is the husband? Is she possibly involved?
Raymond's not here. Why is he not here? No one has to define what suspicious is. You know it when you see it.
Lt.Joe Kenda is investigating the murder of 36-year-old Mona King and her sister, 38-year-old Carla Cannon.
I was on the front page of the paper, and all it said was a double murder, and it gave the address. I said, well, that sounds like Mona's address. So it was hard.
The sisters were found shot to death in Mona's house.
They are sisters born and raised in a farm in Kansas, both very pretty girls, and certainly different in every regard. You have Carla, who is the party-goer, and you have Mona, who is the church-goer.
After speaking to Mona's father-in-law, Cecil King, Kenda has learned that Mona and her husband Raymond recently separated, which makes Raymond a potential suspect.
We asked Cecil, what does Ray do for a living? Well, Ray's an electrician. He works for a commercial electrical contractor. He's worked there for a number of years. They consider him to be an excellent employee.
Cecil also explains that Ray's been on vacation the past 2 weeks.
Has Ray ever been in trouble with the law?
No, Ray has never had a problem with the law.
He has no record with us. None. He's never gotten a parking ticket. Perfectly clean record.
And Ray doesn't own any guns.
When I learn what limited facts I already know about Raymond King, nothing about him says he's a suspect in anything. He just doesn't fit the mold here.
So far, it's looking unlikely that younger sister Mona King was targeted for murder.
What can you tell me about Carla?
Her husband is a chiropractor in Grand Junction, Dr. Donald Cannon.
Carla had 2 children she doted on, 16-year-old Dennis and 15-year-old Danielle, but her relations with Donald were strained.
Cecil says that she and her husband weren't getting along.
I want you to go downtown with me, but if you don't, I'm not coming home
I'm not
tonight.
going downtown because guess what? I have to work to pay these bills, and obviously you don't have time to do.
You, Donald.
Oh, that's nice.
She wanted out of the marriage. She wanted out of everything.
Carla had been invited by Mona to come live with her while she figured out what she was going to do next.
When Carla left Donald, it triggered what would become a bitter divorce.
The doctor was very upset about that and angry about it. Felt abandoned. Now that, in my mind, equals a very strong motive.
Lieutenant Kenda, dispatch.
21 Roger.
Yeah, I need you to contact Grand Junction PD and have them pick up Dr. Donald Cannon.
What if Donald recovers from the shock and then the anger starts and it begins to build? What if it simmers for 5 months and we drive down here from Grand Junction to get some retribution?
300 miles away in Grand Junction, Colorado, local police track down Kenda's suspect.
When the Grand Junction police contact Donald, Donald is very angry with Carla. Very angry. Why are you so angry at Carla? Is it Carla that's the problem, or is it you, Donald?
So, Donald, what's the nature of your relationship with Carla?
She's my ex-wife. We were married about 20 years. We divorced last year. We had 2 kids together.
He tells them that he and Carla fell out of love with each other. Carla liked to go out. She liked to dance. They fought about that.
Her husband, Donald, was much more conservative, and he preferred to want to stay home and not do those kinds of things.
She always said to him she wanted more out of life than he could offer. eventually leading to a divorce.
Do you honestly think that I murdered my wife?
Donald may be furious with Carla, but he insists he would never lay a hand on her, and he claims to have an alibi to back it up.
And what do you have to say?
Well, come to find out, he was at a conference in Salt Lake all weekend.
And he was at the Hotel Salt Lake the entire time?
He was.
How about the airline?
We did check with them.
He flew home on Sunday, and he was in the air during the time frame of his killing.
That is confirmed.
I really appreciate you doing that for me. Great, I owe you one.
No problem.
Thanks.
I'm disappointed. What better motive than leaving a marriage in a lurch? But it's not him. So we have to dismiss that and start over. Who is it now?
Given that Mona King was a homebody and her sister was the opposite, Kenda continues to focus on Carla Cannon's life. Could a newly single Carla have met someone dangerous?
We find the Central Station nightclub, a popular bar that has a big dance floor.
What can I do for you?
Do you know Carla Cannon?
Yeah, she comes in here.
Do you happen to know the name of the guy she hangs out with when she's here?
I'm a lot better with faces than I am with names. The guy at the end of the bar. Seen them hanging out before.
That guy right there?
Mm-hmm.
The bartender saw the man hanging around Carla Saturday night, the night before she was murdered.
Bingo. That didn't take long. So now we find ourselves talking to Jerry Norberg. He is a regular. He's a white guy in his 30s, middle 30s, wears Western clothes.
Nice boots.
Oh, thanks.
I'm looking at his boots and I'm thinking about boot prints at the house.
Jerry, we're here investigating the murder of Carla Cannon and her sister Mona.
He said, I like Carla a lot. Carla's real nice. I consider her a pretty hot chick.
Can you tell me how you knew her?
Oh, we met here. We started going out for a while, went out a few times, but it kind of fizzled out.
Jerry says on Saturday night he tried to strike up a conversation with Carla, but she was giving him the cold shoulder.
Did you talk to her then?
Well, I tried to, but she kind of blew me off.
The way Jerry tells the story is that he's pretty interested in Carla, but he also implies that Carla is not as interested in him as he would like her to be.
Could Jerry Nordberg have been jealous enough to confront Carla at the house? Did Mona have the misfortune to be home too?
It's possible, I suppose. It's unlikely in my opinion. Nothing about his behavior alarms me. Nothing about his mannerisms alarm me. He makes strong eye contact with me. He is honest with me. He's not trying to protect himself from anything.
As Kenda prepares to leave, something Jerry says catches his attention.
Yeah, I hate to hear that about those girls. Carla and Mona are really nice ladies.
You knew Mona also?
Oh, yeah.
How'd you know her?
Well, she used to come in here with Carla.
Mona came in here also?
Yeah.
All right, well, I appreciate your help.
I am really surprised. Are we talking about Mona the housewife, Mona the mom, Mona the churchgoer?
What's more, it seems that Mona wasn't coming out just to keep her sister company.
Mona's not watching Carla dance with other men and drink and talk to them. She's doing the same thing.
Maybe it's not Carla's personal life Kenda should be looking into, but Mona's.
Mona has a secret life. It certainly is from most of her friends.
Lt.Joe Kenda is investigating the double murder of Mona King and Carla Cannon, two sisters who were found shot to death inside Mona's house.
There's something I'm not understanding. There's a hole in the story. I know it's there, and I know it's missing, but I just can't decide what it is.
Multiple statements confirm that Carla Cannon, who was recently divorced, liked to go out dancing. But to Kenda's surprise, Carla's quiet church-going sister had recently been joining in on the fun.
That's not the normal Mona, but Carla may had an influence on that.
They're meeting different men. What if they meet the wrong one? What if something goes terribly wrong and they wind up dead as a result?
To solve this case, Kenda needs to look into Mona's private life. Her family puts him in touch with her best friend, Suzanne Conway.
I'm very sorry about your friend.
Thank you.
Can you tell me about Mona's relationship with her husband?
I remember her saying that, she wanted more excitement in her life, and there was no one for her to hang out with in her neighborhood.
Mona explained to Suzanne that she's bored, that she has very little activity in her life. Her husband Ray works all the time.
She had tried to talk to her husband multiple times, that she wanted him around.
Why don't we go out tonight? We're gonna do something different.
Do what?
Let's just go get a drink somewhere, do something different.
Oof, tired.
I'm tired too, but I want to go have fun. I want to live my life.
And he just wouldn't listen. He seemed like he didn't care.
Ray was not a communicator. She attempted numerous times to get him to sit down and talk to her about the problems that were going on, and she just could not get him to communicate with her.
But when Carla's divorce went through and she moved in with Mona and Ray, it quickly shook things up.
Mona probably feels some degree of envy. Why can't I be more like Carla and less like me? And I think that's how Carla becomes the catalyst without even knowing it.
Hi. She wants us to go out for an hour or so. You wanna go?
Her sister was recently divorced, and I think she was trying to help by taking her out, trying to entertain her. They went to clubs a lot, and I think it made it worse.
Carla provides an avenue of escape for Mona to get her out of the boredom, out of that house, into the bar life, dancing out and about where the music is loud and the lights are bright.
Not long after Mona started going out to clubs with Carla, Mona and Ray separated.
Can you think of anything in particular that led to their breakup?
Yeah, she said she had started seeing someone.
Mona has met someone in a bar, and he and she have become an item in the last 4 months. Mona admits to her that she had sex outside the marriage.
Do you know what that person's name was?
Wayne Lewis.
Wayne Lewis. We go back to our first few minutes at the crime scene, and there stands Wayne Lewis announcing he's a concerned friend of Mona's.
Not only was Wayne involved with Mona, he deliberately withheld that information from Kenda.
How good is that? Are we that lucky?
What type of vehicle does he drive?
I believe he drives a white van. I think it might be a company van, but I don't think there's any words on it.
That fits very nicely with what the neighbor says he sees at that house on the day of the murders. So he has become the focus of my attention at the moment.
Kenda has Wayne Lewis hauled in for questioning.
So I look at him and I said, "So are you intimate with Mona?" "Oh, no, I'm not intimate with her. I just met her in this bar and I listened to her describe her marital issues." "Right. Okay, Wayne, so the reason you speak to attractive women in bars is to offer your services as a marriage counselor?"
You lied to us, Wayne. You told us you weren't romantically involved with either one of the victims.
And I said, Wayne. I really don't like it when people lie to me. Convince me you didn't kill 2 women. Because right now, I'm thinking you did. And that turned him white as a piece of paper.
She told me she was married, but that she was having problems with her husband.
He befriended Mona, and they talked quite a bit.
And of course he listens, he is friends with her. He'd like it to be more than friends. So he steps up his campaign of dating her.
I was sleeping with her, all right? I was. But I didn't kill her.
Wayne admits that he was out with Mona on Saturday night.
Then we went home, and we spent most of the day together Sunday at my house.
The day she was murdered.
She said that she needed to go home Sunday night. So I said, well, I'll just drive you over there.
Wayne claims Mona was very much alive when he dropped her off at her house at 5:30 p.m. When he got back home, he hung out with his neighbors the rest of the night.
Went to work the next morning.
And there's people that can verify that?
Yeah.
We take that information and we confirm it.
All right, stay put. We'll check on this.
Wayne was with the neighbors, the married couple, until 10:30 or 11.
But even though Wayne's story checks out, it doesn't prove his innocence.
Time frame of the death, 1:30 to 8:30. He says he's there at 5:30 dropping her off. What did he do in the meantime? Did he take that extra minute and kill everybody? Sure he could have.
Kenda's suspicions remain, but there's no concrete evidence to use against Wayne.
You're free to go. I better not find out you had anything to do with this.
Thanks.
Determined to dig up new evidence, Kenda returns to the scene of the crime.
When you initially arrive at a crime scene, you will search it in a surface kind of way. You're looking for obvious things. I want to go take another look and see if there's something I overlooked or something that I can reel Wayne into the boat with. I passed by the refrigerator and there's a piece of green paper with a magnet on it. And I started looking at it. It's a receipt from a key service with a date a few days before the murder. And the receipt reads to change all locks in the house. Why is Mona changing the locks? So I go speak to this locksmith.
How you doing, Detective Kenda?
Hey, good. What can I do for you?
Did you happen to work on this job a couple weeks ago?
Miss King, yeah, I changed the locks out in her house.
Did she say why she wanted them changed?
She's having some kind of trouble with her husband.
What kind of problem?
Not sure, really. She just seems scared of him.
Did you notice anything, or did she happen to say anything else that seemed out of the ordinary?
Basic job, really.
All right, well, thank you for your help.
No problem.
The locksmith's information is an eye-opener.
That goes against everything we've heard about Raymond Lee King. Mr. Quiet, Mr. Dedicated, Mr. Electrician, Mr. Wonderful Guy. What has he done or said that makes Mona afraid of him? Because something did.
Lt.Joe Kenda is investigating the murders of Mona King and Carla Cannon. Kenda's just learned that Mona, who recently separated from her husband Raymond, may have been living in fear of him.
I found it interesting when the locksmith tells me that she's changing these locks because of the impending divorce.
Kenda would like to ask Ray King a few pointed questions, but he was initially told Ray's been on vacation. Instead, he heads to Ray's employer, ICG Electric, to see when he's due back.
You have a Ray King that works for you?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell me about him?
Nice guy. Seems to get along with everyone.
He was a little quiet. He wasn't boisterous at all. He was articulate. And he communicated well with people.
Everybody indicated that he was an excellent worker. However, a couple of weeks prior to this, Ray had come to them and indicated that he was going through some marital problems, needed some time off because he needed to get his life in order.
One thing he says really trips my trigger. I said, when's he scheduled to come back to work?
He's due back today.
You know if he's here?
I don't know, but I can find out for you.
I appreciate that.
Linda, is Ray King in today? I called our dispatcher and asked her where Ray was, and she tried him on the radio, and there was no response.
Okay, thank you, Linda. He's not here.
Is that unusual? Oh, Ray's never done this. Ray's always here I don't like it when people aren't where they're supposed to be. That are even remotely connected to a killing.
Do you happen to know where he's been staying?
I believe he's staying with his brother.
Do you happen to have that address?
Sure, I can give that to you.
Kenda races the 40 miles to Pueblo, Colorado, where Ray's brother, Bob King, is living.
How you doing, Detective Kenda, Detective Arms?
So we start talking to him about Ray. Has Ray been staying here? Well, off and on he stays here.
Bob explains that this house actually belongs to somebody else. He and Ray have been house-sitting while the owners are traveling.
Can you tell me about the problems that Ray and Mona were having?
I don't know any of the particulars of what's going on. I do know that he wanted her to go to marriage counseling, and she didn't want to go.
That certainly turns off the possibility of a reconciliation. That puts Ray in a position of having to make a decision. If he can't reconcile with Mona, what's he going to do? Anything is possible, from abandonment to murder.
When was the last time you saw Ray?
Last Saturday, he came by to borrow my car.
Bob tells Kenda he lent Ray his blue pickup truck, which is identical to the one spotted at the crime scene.
Now, Ray doesn't happen to own a gun, does he?
No.
How about you? You own one?
No.
How about the homeowners?
Actually, they've got quite a collection downstairs, I believe.
Is it possible to get him on the telephone?
Yeah, sure. Let me just give him a call.
We find Herb Ritchie by telephone. Herb Ritchie is the owner of the house where Bob is house watching, and he's also a gun collector. I tell Herb Ritchie we're investigating a homicide.
Do you happen to own a .22 caliber? You do.
And he says, I have two Smith & Wesson Model 17 6-shot .22 caliber revolvers.
This information gels with the 12 shell casings discovered at the crime scene and supports Kenda's original theory that two guns were used to commit the murders.
Would you mind if I took a look?
Kenda checks Herb Ritchie's gun cabinet. Sure enough, the .22s are missing.
My man is Ray. Ray's got two guns, he's got 50 rounds of ammo, and he's already killed twice. And I don't know where he is. Where are you, Ray? And how is this going to end?
Do you have any idea where your brother may be?
He bought a piece of property over in the Black Forest a few years ago, and he goes there sometimes.
His intent was to build a custom home on that ground. And that he was excited about it, and that he and Mona were going to live there with their daughter. He wanted to have another child, and he saw this as his dream place.
Bob gives Kenda the address of Ray's land in Black Forest, a wooded development just outside of Colorado Springs.
Lieutenant Kenda, dispatch. Yeah, I need you to put an APB out on a Ray King, possibly driving a silver and blue pickup truck.
But he already fears what they may find.
This is a guy who's never committed a crime ever. He's never gotten a parking ticket. Who has been pressed to his limit by his emotions. I think he's killed two people. I think he's going to kill himself. It's possible he's sitting on that 7 acres of ground with a gun in his mouth as we speak.
Joe Kenda is on a race against time, searching for Raymond King, a man he believes killed his wife, Mona King, and her sister-in-law, Carla Cannon.
You never know what anybody's going to do when they put themselves in the position Ray's put himself in. Particularly when he's not a criminal. He's not predictable at all. And I want to find him right away. I don't want anybody else to get hurt.
Raymond may be hiding out on a parcel of land he purchased in hopes of one day building a dream house for his wife.
He's got 7 acres of ground in Black Forest, his dream that's now never going to happen. I send the sheriff's department to that acreage to see what they can find. I put an all points bulletin for Raymond Lee King, the Ford Ranger pickup. We put that out to the entire state of Colorado and all surrounding states. There's nothing there. No tire tracks, no nothing. Okay, that's not where he is.
The search continues overnight and into the next day. Suddenly, his radio crackles. It's the news he's been waiting to hear.
Colorado State Patrol comm center calls and said, I've got a trooper behind him. Mile marker 135, Interstate 25 between Pueblo and Colorado Springs.
With your left hand, open the driver's door slowly. Step out of the vehicle and face away from me.
They do stop him. They get him out of the truck at gunpoint. He does not resist.
Get down on your knees.
The two .22 caliber revolvers were located, as well as some additional ammunition.
He had 30 rounds of .22 ammunition in his pocket, live, and $700 in cash.
At the station, Kenda's men discover even more evidence against Ray.
They're cowboy boots, and I see that there is dried blood on the outside edges of the soles.
Ray's boots are a match for the prints found at the crime scene. But even as the evidence against him continues to mount, Ray seems oddly oblivious.
The best word to describe Ray at this point is he's spacey. His eyes are not focusing on me or anything. He's looking at me, then he looks at the wall, then he looks at the ceiling, he looks at the floor. He's kind of out of it. He's emotionally not there.
We got you, Ray. We had a witness that put your truck at the scene of the crime. We got the guns. Hell, you come in here with blood on your boots. I'm guessing when we test that, that's going to be the victims? You ready to tell us what happened?
Well, I went over there to talk to Mona, and she wasn't there.
He says he takes guns with him to make Mona listen to him. And he thinks the guns are going to do that.
Ray claims while he was waiting for Mona, he laid one of those guns down, and Carla got her hands on it.
And he said, I tried to take it from her, and that damn thing went off. And he said, she was sitting there on the floor, and she said, shoot me more so I don't suffer.
It's one of the most far-fetched explanations Kenda's ever heard.
We just looked at him. What about Mona, Ray? What about that? Well, I was going to shoot myself, and then Mona walked in on me. And I don't remember what happened after that.
Kenda has a very different take on what happened.
His plan is clear. He has 2 guns and 50 rounds of ammunition. He's going to terminate his problem, which in his case are 2 people, Mona and Carla. When he gets there, I think he expects to find them both.
Ray, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here.
But he doesn't. He finds Carla, and he kills her immediately. Then he reloads, dumping those empties on the stereo cabinet, putting fresh ammo in both guns, and he waits.
Ray was so focused on the task at hand that he carelessly left the casings behind.
And when Mona comes in that door, she never knows what hit her.
Carla, are you home?
He starts blasting. Then it ends right there.
Ray was charged initially with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of crime of violence for the deaths of Carla and Mona.
With the overwhelming evidence against him, it doesn't take long for a jury to render their verdict.
He is convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and is sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Raymond Lee King will never get out of jail.
You never know why people do things. Thinking of Ray, I would have never suspected, but I've learned that you never really know what will push a button of somebody.
I thought something mentally snapped in him. There is no way that in the normal course of events would kill two women.
I think Ray was the kind of person that didn't know how to handle his feelings. And so I think when he was confronted with the real facts, I just don't think he was capable emotionally of dealing with it any other way than to just make it go away.
This is a murder no one would ever expect, occurring to 2 women that no one would ever believe would be the victim of a violent crime, perpetrated by someone who no one would ever believe would do that. It is a study in how things can go so.
At 5:42 a.m., when the city should have been exhaling into dawn, a phone rang inside a narrow apartment in Queens, and the sound of it cut through the dark like a blade, sharp, urgent, wrong, because nobody called at that hour unless something had already gone terribly off course. Outside, New York was still half asleep, subway tunnels humming, street lights flickering, trash bags piled like silent witnesses along the curb, and somewhere between the East River and the cracked sidewalks of a quiet residential block, the story began that would refuse to end, the story that would stain the year 2000 with a question mark that no amount of time could erase. The voice on the other end of the line was shaking, words tumbling over each other, a name repeated again and again, and by the time the call ended, the air inside that apartment felt heavier, as if the walls themselves understood what had just been set in motion. It was the kind of neighborhood people trusted, brick houses pressed close together, families who had lived there for decades, kids walking to school alone, doors locked more out of habit than fear. And that was precisely why what followed felt like a betrayal. Patrol cars arrived first, their red and blue lights washing over parked sedans and darkened windows, splashing color onto faces that had not yet learned what to be afraid of. Officers moved quickly but quietly, radios crackling, boots on pavement, eyes scanning for something that didn't belong, because something clearly didn't. A body had been reported. Not found in an alley or beneath a bridge, not hidden in some forgotten corner of the city, but inside a modest apartment where nothing looked broken, nothing looked forced, nothing looked like a struggle had ever happened. The victim was young, mid-20s, known by neighbors as polite, quiet, the kind of person you nodded to in the hallway and forgot moments later. No criminal record. No obvious enemies. A job downtown that paid the bills and left little behind in terms of drama. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were intact. There were no signs of robbery. Wallet still there. Keys still on the hook by the door. The scene didn't scream violence, it whispered it, and that whisper unsettled even the most seasoned detective standing in that room, staring at a life that had stopped without leaving instructions. Crime scene techs moved in slow, deliberate patterns, photographing everything, collecting fibers, lifting prints, while detectives stood back, arms crossed, minds racing ahead of the evidence, because this was already shaping up to be the kind of case that refused to make itself easy. A cold case doesn't announce itself on day one, but there is always a moment, early on, when investigators feel it in their bones, that subtle sense that something is missing, that the usual rules don't apply, that this won't be solved by the next press conference, or the next lucky tip. This was that moment. The silence in the apartment was too clean. The answers were too far away. By mid-morning, word spread. Neighbors gathered in small clusters behind yellow tape, whispering theories, pointing at windows, replaying last night in their heads, wondering if they had heard something they should have questioned, something they should have reported. A woman across the street insisted she saw a shadow near the building just after midnight. A man pacing, smoking, disappearing into the darkness. Another neighbor swore they heard nothing at all, not a sound, not a scream, not even raised voices. The absence of noise became its own kind of clue, a chilling suggestion that whatever happened inside that apartment was swift, controlled, intentional. The media arrived soon after, vans lining the street, cameras angled toward the building, reporters practicing solemn expressions before going live, and within hours, the city had a new headline to absorb. Young professional found dead in Queen's apartment. No signs of forced entry. Police search for answers. The year 2000 was supposed to feel like a beginning, a clean break into a new millennium, but New York had already learned that time does not reset itself so easily. This case slid into the public consciousness quietly at first, just another tragic story in a city that produced too many of them, but beneath the surface, something darker was forming. Detectives began where they always did, reconstructing the victim's final days, tracing movements, phone calls, emails, receipts, routines. Co-workers were interviewed, friends contacted, family notified and questioned with a careful balance of compassion and suspicion. Everyone said the same thing. There was nothing unusual, nothing alarming, no threats, no recent arguments, no reason to believe this person was in danger. That kind of normality can be damning. It leaves nowhere to look. It offers no obvious motive, no clear suspect, no narrative to follow. An autopsy revealed the cause of death, but not the why. The method suggested precision, not rage. No excessive force. No chaotic violence. It was as if someone had come to that apartment with a single purpose and left without a trace, confident enough to believe the city would swallow the evidence. Toxicology reports came back clean. No drugs. No alcohol. Nothing that explained vulnerability. The timeline narrowed to a small window late at night, a few hours when the city outside was alive with noise and movement, when a single death could easily disappear into the background hum of New York. Investigators combed through phone records, focusing on the last incoming call, the last outgoing message, the last digital footprint left behind. There were names that surfaced briefly, then faded away under scrutiny. An ex-partner who lived out of state. A co-worker who had once argued over a promotion. A neighbor who kept to himself and avoided eye contact. Each lead flared up, promising clarity, and then burned out, leaving only frustration in its wake. Alibis checked out. Stories aligned. Timelines refused to crack. As days turned into weeks, the case began to change shape. What had started as a straightforward homicide investigation slowly hardened into something colder, something heavier. The press coverage thinned, attention shifting to louder crimes, bigger scandals, but inside the precinct, the file grew thicker, heavier, more complicated. Detectives pinned photos to corkboards, drew lines between names, circled unanswered questions in red marker, and stared at the wall late into the night, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. Then came the strange details, the ones that didn't fit neatly into reports, but refused to be ignored. A neighbor mentioned seeing the apartment lights on at an unusual hour days before the body was discovered. A building superintendent recalled a complaint about a door-locking mechanism that had been fixed months earlier, but suddenly felt relevant again. A security camera 2 blocks away captured a figure walking with purpose, face obscured, hands in pockets, moving toward the subway at exactly the wrong time. The footage was grainy, the angle unhelpful, the identity unknowable, but it haunted the investigation like a ghost caught on tape. Community unease grew. People double-locked doors. Parents walked children to school again. The sense of safety that had defined that block eroded quietly, replaced by a low-grade anxiety that lingered in elevators and stairwells. Someone had gotten in. Someone had killed. Someone had left. And no one knew who, or why. Candlelight vigils were held. Flowers piled up near the building entrance. The victim's name appeared on posters, on local news segments, on the lips of neighbors who had barely known them, but now felt bound by the shared fear of the unknown. Months passed. Leads dried up. Detectives rotated off the case, reassigned, promoted, retired. New investigators picked up the file, bringing fresh eyes and the same inevitable frustration. Every re-examination returned to the same dead ends. No weapon recovered. No confession. No forensic miracle. The case slipped further back in the filing cabinets, labeled but unresolved, alive only in paperwork and memory. And yet, it never truly disappeared. Every few years, something would stir it awake again. A tip from a psychic. A jailhouse rumor. A new forensic technique that promised to see what old science could not. Each time, hope flickered. Each time, it died just as quickly. The city changed. Buildings were renovated. People moved away. The neighborhood aged. But the question remained, stubborn and sharp, lodged deep in the collective mind of those who remembered. By the end of the decade, the phrase, cold case, had attached itself permanently to the file, a quiet admission of defeat disguised as classification. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in a city obsessed with surveillance, speed, and answers, some truths slip through the cracks. The year 2000 felt farther away with each passing season, but the unresolved death in that Queen's apartment refused to fade into history. It lingered like an unresolved chord, a story without an ending, a silence that still echoed every time someone asked the simplest, most terrifying question of all. Who did this, and how did they vanish so completely into the noise of New York? The file never truly slept. It waited. It sat in a metal drawer inside a precinct that smelled of old coffee and copier toner, surrounded by hundreds of other folders that told cleaner stories, stories with endings, arrests, convictions, signatures at the bottom of the page. This one had none of that. Just dates, times, unanswered questions, and a photograph clipped to the front, a face frozen in ordinary life, smiling without knowing how easily a smile could become evidence. Every detective who touched that folder felt the same unease, the sense that the case was watching back, daring them to try again. In the months after the funeral, investigators circled back to the beginning, because when progress stops, you rewind. They rewalked the hallway outside the apartment, counting steps, measuring distances, imagining footsteps in the early hours of the morning. They stood by the front door, staring at the lock, the deadbolt, the frame, the hinges, asking how someone could enter without force and leave without trace. Friends said the victim was cautious, not paranoid, but careful, the kind of person who checked the peephole before opening the door, who didn't buzz strangers in late at night. That detail alone narrowed the possibilities and widened the mystery. Whoever came in was either trusted, convincing, or already inside. The timeline became the obsession. Detectives reconstructed the final evening minute by minute, using receipts, transit records, surveillance footage from nearby streets. The victim left work at a predictable time, caught the same subway line, exited the same station, stopped briefly at a corner store where a grainy camera caught a familiar silhouette buying a bottle of water. Nothing unusual. No one followed closely enough to stand out. The city swallowed them whole on the walk home, just another commuter among thousands, and yet that walk would be the last confirmed sighting of them alive. Inside the apartment, the scene remained stubbornly neutral. Furniture undisturbed. No broken glass. No overturned chairs. The bed neatly made, as if sleep had been planned, expected. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of panic. That absence suggested control, maybe even consent, at least at the start. Detectives debated quietly over coffer-stained desks whether the victim had known their killer, whether familiarity had opened the door and sealed their fate. It was a theory that made sense and explained nothing at the same time. Interviews resumed, this time more pointed, more uncomfortable. Friends were asked about secrets, hidden relationships, arguments that might have seemed trivial at the time. Co-workers were pressed about office dynamics, jealousy, money, rumors. A supervisor admitted to tension over a missed promotion, but had been miles away that night. A friend recalled a recent date, someone new, someone charming, someone whose last name they couldn't remember. That name became a question mark in the margins of the file, circled, underlined, chased until it led nowhere. The building itself came under scrutiny. Tenants were re-interviewed, their stories compared against old notes, looking for shifts, inconsistencies, memories reshaped by time. A man on the third floor mentioned hearing footsteps on the stairs around 2 a.m., slow, deliberate, not running, not sneaking, just moving. A woman below the victim's apartment recalled a brief thud, something heavy, then silence. None of it was definitive. All of it was just enough to keep hope alive and frustration burning. The security camera footage from 2 blocks away was analyzed frame by frame, enhanced, enlarged, slowed down until the pixels bled into each other. The figure remained a silhouette, gender unclear, face hidden by shadow and motion blur. They walked with purpose, not hurried, not relaxed, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Detectives argued whether the person was arriving or leaving, whether the camera had caught the beginning or the end of something irreversible. Without context, the footage was a mirror, reflecting whatever theory the viewer already believed. As the first-year anniversary approached, pressure mounted. Families want answers. Communities want closure. Police departments want results. The media briefly returned, recycling old footage, asking the same questions with slightly different phrasing. Still no arrests. Investigation ongoing. Family pleads for information. Tips trickled in again, fueled by renewed attention. Most were useless. Some were cruel. A few felt promising, only to collapse under verification. One tip, however, refused to die. An anonymous caller claimed the victim had been involved in something risky, something secret, something that went beyond their quiet routine. No specifics. No names. Just a suggestion that there was more beneath the surface. Detectives chased it anyway, because in a case like this, even whispers are loud. Financial records were reviewed again. Emails reread. Personal belongings examined with fresh eyes. Still nothing. The victim's life remained stubbornly ordinary, and that ordinariness became its own kind of anomaly. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA databases grew. Old evidence was retested whenever budgets allowed. Fibers that had once been meaningless were examined again under new methods. Partial profiles emerged, then disappeared into statistical noise. No matches. No hits. The killer, if they had left anything behind at all, had either been lucky or careful enough to stay invisible. Each negative result tightened the knot in the stomachs of those still invested in the case. Inside the precinct, the file gained a reputation. New detectives heard about it in hushed tones, a cautionary example during late-night shifts. The case that looked simple and wasn't. The locked room mystery without theatrics, without spectacle, just a quiet death and an open question. Some tried to solve it in their heads, tracing imaginary paths, convinced they could see what others had missed. Most eventually moved on, worn down by the weight of a story that refused to cooperate. Outside, the neighborhood continued to change. Old tenants moved out. New ones moved in, unaware of what had happened within those walls years earlier. The apartment was renovated, repainted, rented again. Laughter returned. Music played. Life reclaimed the space, but the past never fully loosened its grip. Longtime residents still lowered their voices when they passed the building, still remembered the police tape, the cameras, the fear that had briefly rewritten their sense of safety. The family never stopped asking. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Each year without answers felt heavier than the last. They kept the victim's room exactly as it had been, personal items untouched, as if preserving the moment before everything went wrong. They attended meetings with detectives who changed faces, but not their message. We're still working on it. No new developments. We haven't forgotten. Words that sounded supportive and hollow all at once. Then, nearly a decade later, something shifted. A minor detail, long overlooked, resurfaced during a routine audit of cold cases. A note scribbled in the margin of an early report, barely legible, referencing a service call logged in the building days before the death. A technician. A scheduled visit. Someone who had legitimate access to multiple apartments. The name had been checked once, quickly cleared, filed away. Now it was pulled back into the light, not because it was obviously suspicious, but because everything else had failed. Detectives tracked down the technician, older now, life moved on, memory blurred by time. He cooperated willingly, answered questions calmly, provided records, receipts, explanations. Nothing directly tied him to the crime. No motive. No evidence. Another door closed. Another lead dissolved. The case exhaled again, slipping back into its familiar stalemate. By the time the 15th anniversary arrived, the language around the investigation had changed. Unsolved. Cold. Dormant. Words that sounded clinical, but carried emotional weight. The file was thinner now, stripped of false hopes, reduced to essentials. And yet, for those who knew it, the case still pulsed faintly, a reminder that some crimes don't need chaos to be devastating. Sometimes all they need is silence, patience, and a city big enough to hide the truth in plain sight. The question remained unanswered, hovering over the years like a low cloud. How does someone die in the heart of New York, behind a locked door, without leaving behind the story of who came knocking? Cold cases don't end with a bang. They stretch. They thin out. They fade into routines and paperwork and the quiet resignation that settles in when every obvious door has been opened and shut again. By the time the case crossed its 10th year, it no longer lived on desks. It lived in memories, in instincts, in the occasional late-night conversation between detectives who couldn't quite let it go. The city had moved on, louder, faster, shinier, but this death from the year 2000 remained like a crack beneath fresh paint, invisible to most, impossible to forget for those who knew where to look. The investigation entered a new phase without announcing itself. There was no press release, no renewed task force, just a slow, methodical re-examination driven by a single uncomfortable truth: the original assumptions might have been wrong. For years, the theory of familiarity had dominated. The idea that the victim opened the door willingly, that trust had been weaponized. But as detectives reread transcripts and re-listened to taped interviews, that narrative began to wobble. People remember what makes sense. People smooth over contradictions. And time has a way of turning uncertainty into confidence. One detail resurfaced with unsettling clarity. The lock. Not the deadbolt itself, but the way it behaved. Early reports noted that it was functional, intact, no signs of tampering. Case closed on that point. But a junior detective, newly assigned to cold cases, and unburdened by the emotional fatigue of the original investigation, noticed something subtle. The lock could be engaged without a key from the inside, but under certain conditions, it could appear locked even if it had been manipulated earlier. It wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. Rare. Unintuitive. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. That realization didn't solve anything. But it cracked open possibility. If the door didn't require trust to open, then the list of suspects widened dramatically. It didn't need to be someone close. It could have been someone convincing. Someone opportunistic. Someone who understood buildings, routines, access. Someone who blended in. Attention shifted outward. Not just who knew the victim, but who knew the building. Delivery workers. Maintenance staff. Temporary contractors. Anyone with a reason to be there and a reason not to stand out. Logs were pulled. Old invoices unearthed. Names that had once been footnotes were elevated to full paragraphs. Most were dead ends, but one name kept reappearing in unrelated contexts, not because it was incriminating, but because it was everywhere. This individual had worked multiple short-term jobs in the area around that time. Cable installation. Repair work. Freelance labor. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just a pattern of access. They weren't close to the victim. They weren't even memorable. Which, in a case like this, felt less like an alibi and more like a warning sign. People who are remembered tend to leave impressions. People who vanish into the background can do almost anything unnoticed. Investigators tried to reconstruct the city as it was then, before smartphones, before constant digital exhaust. They relied on paper records, landline logs, memory. They walked routes again, not just the victims, but the suspects' possible paths, mapping out how someone could move through that neighborhood late at night without raising alarms. They stood on corners at 2 a.m., listening to the way sound traveled, how footsteps could echo or disappear, how easily a life could end without drawing attention. Still, evidence refused to cooperate. There was nothing tying this individual directly to the apartment that night. No witnesses. No camera footage. No forensic material. Just proximity and possibility. In the world of criminal investigation, that's not enough. It's suspicion without substance. And suspicion alone doesn't survive courtrooms or time. The family, exhausted but resilient, pushed for renewed attention. They spoke to advocacy groups. They contacted journalists who specialized in forgotten cases. Slowly, cautiously, the story re-entered the public conversation. Not as breaking news, but as a haunting question from another era. Do you remember this? What really happened? Why has no one been held accountable? The tone was quieter now, less sensational, but somehow heavier. A decade of silence adds weight to every word. With that attention came new tips. Older tips, too, reshaped by memory. A former neighbor, now living out of state, reached out to say something they hadn't thought mattered before. On the night in question, they remembered seeing someone in the hallway who didn't look like a resident. Work boots. Neutral clothing. A polite nod. At the time, it meant nothing. In retrospect, it felt like a mistake. Memory is fragile, detectives knew that, but they wrote it down anyway, because cold cases survive on fragments. Another tip came from a former co-worker, who admitted they had lied during the initial interviews. Not about anything criminal, but about timing. They had seen the victim earlier than they'd said, noticed they seemed distracted, tense, checking the clock repeatedly. When asked why they hadn't mentioned it before, the answer was simple and human. I didn't want to get involved. That single sentence echoed through the case file like a confession and a warning. How many people had chosen distance over truth? The theory shifted again, this time toward anticipation. What if the victim had been expecting someone, not because they trusted them, but because they felt they had no choice? A service call. A dispute. An obligation. That possibility reframed the scene entirely. The neat apartment. The lack of struggle. The controlled nature of the death. Compliance under pressure can look a lot like calm. Investigators searched for any record of disputes, complaints, unresolved issues. There were none on paper. But paper doesn't capture everything. Conversations disappear. Threats go unreported. Fear is often private until it's too late. The case began to feel less like a puzzle with missing pieces, and more like a mirror reflecting the limits of documentation. As the 15th year approached, a quiet desperation crept in. Detectives, who had been young during the original investigation, were now approaching retirement. Files were digitized. Evidence was repackaged. The case was preserved, not because it was close to being solved, but because no one wanted to be the one who let it disappear entirely. There is a difference between unsolved and abandoned, and that line mattered deeply to the people still carrying this story. Then came a development that felt, briefly, like a turning point. A partial DNA profile, once considered unusable, was rerun through an expanded database. The system flagged a distant familial connection. Not a match. A hint. Someone related, perhaps, to whoever had left that trace behind. It wasn't enough for an arrest. It wasn't even enough for a public statement. But inside the precinct, it electrified the room. After all these years, the case had spoken back. Genealogical mapping began quietly. Painstakingly. Names branched out like roots, crossing state lines, decades, lives that had nothing to do with New York in the year 2000. Most leads dissolved under scrutiny. Some never responded. One did. The same name that had surfaced before. The same pattern of access. The same proximity. Now older. Now living elsewhere. Now, at last, impossible to ignore. Detectives traveled. They knocked on a door far from Queens, carrying the weight of 15 years and the risk of another dead end. The conversation was calm. Polite. Cooperative. The individual answered questions without visible stress, acknowledged working in the area back then, denied any involvement, expressed sympathy for the family. There was no confession. No dramatic reveal. Just a familiar frustration dressed up as progress. And yet, something lingered. A pause before an answer. A correction offered too quickly. Details that aligned just a little too well. Nothing provable. Everything unsettling. The kind of interaction that leaves investigators staring at each other afterward, knowing they've touched the edge of something, but lacking the force to push through it. The case remained officially unsolved. The word closed did not apply, no matter what the title might suggest. What closed was the window of easy answers, the hope that time alone would deliver justice. What remained was an ache, persistent and unresolved, a reminder that some crimes are not defined by what is known, but by what slips away, quietly, patiently, until all that's left is the echo of a question asked too late and a city that never noticed the moment it lost the truth. Time did what it always does in unsolved cases. It distorted everything. Memories softened at the edges. Certainty curdled into doubt. What once felt urgent became archival, boxed, labeled, stored. But beneath that administrative calm, the case continued to pulse, irregular and stubborn, refusing to flatline. Every few years, something small would disturb the surface, a name resurfacing, a technique evolving, a question rephrased just enough to sound new. And each time, investigators would lean in again, knowing full well how often hope had already betrayed them. The suspect who lived elsewhere now, the one whose name kept reappearing like an ink stain that never fully washed out, became a focal point without officially becoming anything at all. There was no probable cause. No warrant. No confession waiting to be extracted under fluorescent lights. Just a growing sense that coincidence had overstayed its welcome. Detectives re-examined his history, not for evidence of violence, but for patterns, movement, access, opportunity. He had worked in buildings similar to the one in Queens. He had known how locks worked, how schedules overlapped, how to appear legitimate. In a city obsessed with credentials and uniforms, legitimacy is camouflage. They pulled every record they could legally touch. Employment logs. Tax filings. Old addresses. The gaps were what bothered them most. Months where paperwork went thin. Jobs that began and ended without explanation. Apartments shared briefly, then vacated. None of it illegal. None of it clean. Just enough ambiguity to make the past feel unstable. When questioned again, years after the first interview, the suspect's answers were consistent, almost too consistent, rehearsed by time and repetition. The story never changed because it didn't need to. It had survived scrutiny before. Back in New York, the building itself became an unlikely witness. Renovations had stripped away old fixtures, replaced locks, repainted walls, but floor plans don't forget. Detectives obtained original blueprints, studying access points, service shafts, maintenance routes that bypassed the obvious. There were ways into that apartment that didn't require force or familiarity, ways that would never register as a break-in. The realization didn't solve the case. It made it darker. It suggested that the killer didn't just enter the victim's life. They navigated it. The theory of opportunity hardened into something more deliberate. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. Whoever did this had chosen the moment, the place, the method. They had counted on the city's indifference, on the way millions of people coexist without seeing each other. They had counted on the fact that silence is easier to ignore than screams. And they had been right. The victim's final hours were replayed again, not as a timeline, but as a psychological landscape. What did they know? What did they suspect? Was there fear, buried beneath routine? Or was there resignation, the quiet acceptance that comes when a problem feels too small to report, but too heavy to ignore? Friends had described the victim as private, not secretive, but careful with emotions, unlikely to alarm others without proof. That trait, once endearing, now felt tragic. Caution can be fatal when danger wears a normal face. Another detail, long dismissed as irrelevant, crept back into the narrative. A voicemail. Short. Unremarkable. Left days before the death. The voice was calm, professional, requesting a brief follow-up regarding a previous issue. At the time, it had seemed mundane, the kind of message people delete without thinking. Now, it was isolated, enhanced, analyzed. The voice didn't match anyone the victim knew personally. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't urgent. It was polite. That politeness unsettled investigators more than anger ever could. Politeness opens doors. They tried to trace the number. Disconnected. Prepaid. Untraceable by modern standards, let alone the technology of the early 2000s. Another ghost. Another reminder of how much the world had changed since the night of the crime, and how those changes had arrived too late to matter. If this had happened now, there would be cameras everywhere, metadata trailing every movement, digital breadcrumbs impossible to erase. Back then, the city still had blind spots, and someone had known exactly where they were. Public interest flared again, when a documentary podcast teased the case, framing it as a locked room mystery that defied logic. The response was immediate. Listeners flooded forums with theories, some absurd, some disturbingly plausible. Amateur sleuths dissected every known detail, drawing connections investigators had already considered and discarded. Still, a few observations stung. Outsiders aren't burdened by precedent. They don't know which doors have already collapsed. They ask questions professionals stopped asking years ago. One such question gained traction: why that apartment? Why that victim? In a city of endless anonymity, choice implies intent. Randomness is rare. Even opportunistic crimes have logic. Investigators revisited the idea that the victim had been targeted not for who they were, but for where they lived. The building's layout. Its access points. Its routines. The victim may have simply been the one who answered the door. That possibility reframed everything. It suggested that the crime wasn't personal. It was situational. A test. A rehearsal. Or worse, a pattern that hadn't been recognized because it never repeated in the same way. They searched databases for similar deaths, similar circumstances, similar silences. There were a few. Not enough to declare a serial offender. Enough to be uncomfortable. Enough to wonder how many stories end quietly, mislabeled as accidents, natural causes, misfortune. The suspect, contacted again through intermediaries, declined further interviews. Perfectly legal. Perfectly reasonable. The refusal was framed as self-protection, not guilt, but it landed heavily. Investigators debated pushing harder, knowing the risk. Without new evidence, pressure could backfire, closing doors permanently. The line between persistence and harassment is thin, and crossing it can destroy what little progress exists. They waited. They watched. They documented. They hoped for a mistake. Years continued their march. Detectives retired. New ones inherited the file, reading it like a novel without an ending, trying to feel the urgency of a time they hadn't lived through. The family aged. Parents grew older. Siblings built lives around an absence that never softened. Anniversaries became quieter, more private. Grief doesn't disappear. It adapts. The city, indifferent as ever, kept moving. The building changed hands again. The block filled with new faces. The past receded into trivia, a footnote in a neighborhood history no one read anymore. But somewhere, in an office lined with filing cabinets and flickering monitors, the case remained active in the only way it could be, unresolved, unyielding, unfinished. One detective, nearing the end of his career, summarized it late one night to a colleague who had just joined the unit. He didn't talk about evidence or suspects. He talked about feeling. About the way some cases resist closure not because they are unsolvable, but because they expose something uncomfortable about the world. That sometimes the truth isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, efficient, and gone before anyone thinks to look. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a city isn't chaos, but familiarity. As the file slid back into its drawer, heavier now with years and theories, the title on the tab remained unchanged. No names added. No charges filed. Just a date. A place. And the lingering question that refused to dim with time, in the heart of New York, behind a door that looked locked, how did someone walk in, take a life, and walk back out into the crowd without ever being seen? The case entered its third decade without ceremony. No announcement marked the moment when 20 years had passed since that quiet night in Queens, no sirens, no renewed urgency, just a subtle shift in language. Detectives stopped saying recent. They stopped saying back then. They began saying historical. And with that word came a dangerous implication, that the truth, if it ever surfaced, would belong more to archives than to justice. But history has a way of resurfacing when it's least welcome. It began with a routine evidence review, the kind meant more to satisfy policy than expectation. Boxes were reopened. Labels checked. Chain of custody logs verified. A young analyst, assigned to assist the cold case unit, noticed something that older eyes had skimmed past for years. Not a piece of evidence, but an absence. One item listed in the early inventory was no longer physically present. Not missing in the sense of stolen, but reclassified, moved, absorbed into another case file decades earlier. A clerical decision made under pressure, when the department was drowning in paperwork and didn't yet understand what it was losing. The item was small. A fragment. Collected from the apartment's entryway. At the time, it had been deemed inconclusive, possibly transferred, possibly irrelevant. Now, with modern tools and a renewed hunger for answers, its absence felt loud. Investigators tracked it down, buried in storage under a different case number, mislabeled, forgotten. When it was finally brought back into the light, it didn't look like much. Just another artifact of a life interrupted. But sometimes the smallest pieces carry the longest shadows. Testing began again, quietly. No press. No expectations. The fragment yielded information it never could have before. Not a full profile. Not a smoking gun. But enough to narrow possibilities. Enough to say, definitively, that the DNA did not belong to the victim, and that it had no business being there. Enough to reawaken the genealogical trail that had once fizzled out under limitations that no longer applied. The process was slow, deliberate, almost surgical. Analysts built family trees that stretched backward and outward, mapping relationships between people who had never heard of Queens, never thought about the year 2000, never imagined their distant genetic connection could matter. Names emerged. Then more names. Some were dismissed quickly. Others lingered, uncomfortable and persistent. One branch of that tree led back to the same region, the same line of work, the same type of access. The same man investigators had circled for years without ever landing on. This time, the connection was indirect, distant enough to avoid easy explanation, close enough to refuse dismissal. It wasn't proof. It was context. And context, in cold cases, can be more dangerous than certainty. Detectives approached carefully. They knew better than to rush. They reopened interviews with people who had once been adjacent to the suspect's life. Former co-workers. Old roommates. A supervisor who barely remembered his name, but remembered his habits. He was quiet. Reliable. Disappeared without notice. Moved on often. Never stayed long enough to build roots. Never stayed short enough to raise flags. A man shaped by transition. One former colleague recalled something that had once seemed insignificant. The suspect had complained about a building in Queens. Not angrily. Not emotionally. Just a passing remark about access, about locks that didn't make sense, about how some buildings were too easy. At the time, it had sounded like professional frustration. Now, it sounded like reconnaissance. Memory is treacherous that way, reshaping itself under the weight of new meaning. Investigators reconstructed the suspect's movements with what little remained. Old pay stubs. Transit cards. A credit card charge that placed him in Manhattan earlier that evening. Nothing definitive. Nothing illegal. But the geography lined up too neatly to ignore. He had been in the city. He had been working nearby. He had vanished from records shortly after, relocating without a traceable reason. The pattern repeated elsewhere in his life, a series of arrivals and departures that never quite overlapped long enough to anchor him. When detectives reached out again, this time with more pointed questions, the response was different. Lawyers appeared. Statements were filtered. Cooperation thinned. The tone shifted from polite to guarded. Again, none of this proved guilt. But it altered the temperature of the room. People who have nothing to hide often still hide, but they rarely change their behavior so dramatically when the questions stay the same. The family was informed, cautiously. No promises. No declarations. Just an acknowledgement that progress, however fragile, had been made. Hope returned, tempered by years of disappointment. They had learned not to celebrate too early, not to imagine endings before they existed. Still, something in the air felt different. Less stagnant. Less resigned. Outside the investigation, the world rediscovered the case. Another podcast. Another article. This time, the framing changed. Not a mystery that defied logic, but a failure that exposed blind spots. The narrative shifted from "how could this happen?" to "how did we miss it?" That distinction mattered. It placed responsibility not on fate or chance, but on systems, assumptions, and the quiet errors that compound over time. Public pressure followed. Questions were asked at press briefings. Officials offered careful answers. Ongoing investigation. No comment on potential suspects. We remain committed. Language polished by decades of caution. Behind closed doors, frustration simmered. Everyone involved understood the stakes. A misstep now could collapse everything. A premature accusation could end the case forever. The suspect, aware of the renewed attention, changed routines. Social media accounts vanished. Contact with old acquaintances dried up. He moved again. Legally. Cleanly. Just far enough to complicate surveillance. Investigators watched from a distance, bound by law, by ethics, by the thin line that separates suspicion from proof. They waited for the mistake that might never come. What haunted them most wasn't what they knew. It was what they couldn't know. Whether the victim had sensed the danger. Whether there had been a moment of hesitation at the door. Whether the ordinary politeness of city life had been the final vulnerability. These questions had no evidentiary value, but they lingered, shaping the emotional core of the case. Inside the apartment, now occupied by someone else entirely, life continued without awareness of the history beneath fresh paint and modern locks. The past remained sealed, not by technology, but by indifference. New tenants cooked meals, laughed, slept, unaware that their floor plan had once been scrutinized like a crime scene map, that their doorway had been the threshold of an unsolved death. As investigators prepared their next move, they faced an uncomfortable reality. Even if they were right, even if every instinct aligned, time was their enemy. Witnesses had died. Memories had eroded. Evidence had aged. The legal standard had not softened with the years. Truth alone would not be enough. It never is. It must be proven, beyond doubt, beyond alternative explanation, beyond the reach of a defense built on time itself. And so the case hovered there, once again on the brink of something it had approached many times before. Not closure. Not justice. But clarity. The dangerous kind that forces decisions. The kind that demands action. Somewhere between what was known and what could be proven, the truth waited, patient as it had always been, hidden not in darkness, but in the ordinary spaces where no one thinks to look. The city didn't notice. It never does. But inside a file marked with a date from another century, the story shifted again, quietly, decisively, as if reminding everyone involved that some cases don't end because they want to, but because, eventually, the past refuses to stay buried. Pressure does strange things to a case. It sharpens some instincts and dulls others, turning patience into urgency and caution into risk. By now, the investigation was balanced on that edge. Too much movement could spook the suspect into disappearing again. Too little could let the moment slip away forever. Detectives felt it in the way conversations shortened, in the way meetings ended without conclusions, in the way everyone avoided saying the word they were all thinking, now or never. Surveillance became quieter, more disciplined. No tails. No obvious checks. Just data. Patterns. The slow accumulation of behavior over time. The suspect's life, once opaque, began to outline itself through absence. He avoided routines. Changed jobs frequently. Paid in cash when possible. Lived alone. These were not crimes. They were choices. But taken together, they formed a shape investigators recognized too well. Someone who had learned, early on, how to leave as little behind as possible. They revisited the night again, not as a timeline, but as a decision tree. Every action implied another choice. The suspect would have needed to know the building, the lock, the hours when foot traffic dipped just low enough. He would have needed confidence, not desperation. Someone afraid makes noise. Someone prepared makes silence. The crime scene had been silent. Too silent. That fact never stopped echoing. A former tenant, tracked down through a maze of outdated records, provided an unexpected detail. Years before the murder, there had been complaints about someone entering apartments under the guise of maintenance without proper notice. Nothing had been proven. No one had been caught. The complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings, miscommunications in a busy building. The name attached to one of those service requests matched a company the suspect had once contracted with. Not a direct link. Just another thread. Another almost. Investigators laid everything out on a long table, documents overlapping like layers of sediment. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they told a story that couldn't be easily ignored. Access. Opportunity. Proximity. Behavior after the fact. And now, genetic context. Still no weapon. Still no eyewitness. Still no confession. But the narrative was tightening, the margins shrinking. The room felt smaller. They debated strategy late into the night. One more interview. One controlled confrontation. The risk was obvious. Without new evidence, the suspect could shut down completely. But sometimes pressure reveals what politeness conceals. Sometimes people talk not because they want to, but because silence becomes heavier than words. The interview took place in a neutral space, far from precinct walls, far from anything that could feel coercive. The suspect arrived calm, older now, hair graying, movements slower but deliberate. He listened carefully. He answered selectively. When asked about the Queen's building, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. A micro-adjustment. A breath taken just a fraction too late. Trained eyes noticed. Nothing was said. The moment passed. But it stayed. Then came the question about the voicemail. The suspect frowned, just slightly, as if reaching for a memory he hadn't rehearsed. He denied leaving it. Said he didn't remember calling anyone like that. Said it must be a mistake. The answer was reasonable. Plausible. But it lacked the irritation people usually show when falsely accused. There was no indignation. Just deflection. Another mark in the margins. When the interview ended, there was no arrest, no dramatic turn. Just a shared understanding among the investigators that something had shifted again. The suspect knew the walls were closing in. And knowledge changes behavior. Within weeks, a new development surfaced, quiet but consequential. A tip from another state. An unrelated investigation had flagged the suspect's name during a routine background check. No charges. No violent crimes. But an incident report from years earlier involving an authorized entry into a residential building. It had been resolved internally. No complaint filed. No follow-up. Another missed moment. Another door that had closed too quickly. The legal team reviewed everything, line by line, searching for the crack that would allow them to move forward. The problem wasn't suspicion. It was proof. Circumstantial cases can succeed, but only when the circumstances form an inescapable ring. Here, there were still gaps. Too many. And time had widened them. The family waited again, suspended in that familiar state between hope and disappointment. They had learned to read between the lines of official updates, to hear progress in pauses and tone rather than words. This time felt different, they said. They had said that before. Still, something about the renewed intensity felt heavier, more deliberate. Outside, the city remained oblivious. New headlines crowded old ones out. New tragedies replaced old mysteries. The year 2000 felt like ancient history to most people now, a different era with different rules. But for those tied to the case, time had folded in on itself. Past and present coexisted in the same file, the same questions, the same sleepless nights. The suspect made one more move. He contacted a lawyer he hadn't used before. Someone known for handling complicated cases quietly. Someone who asked few questions and made no statements. That choice was legal, sensible, and devastating to the investigation. It meant the window for voluntary cooperation had closed. Investigators regrouped. If there would be an ending, it would not come easily. They prepared for the possibility that this was as close as the truth would ever get without crossing into certainty. That the case might remain officially unsolved, even if privately understood. That justice, in this instance, might be partial, imperfect, delayed beyond usefulness. Late one night, alone in the office, a detective reread the original report. The first entry. The call at 5:42 a.m. The quiet apartment. The locked door. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The case was no longer just about who did it. It was about how easily someone could do it, how systems fail not through malice, but through routine, assumption, and the comforting belief that ordinary things are harmless. The detective closed the file gently, as if it might bruise. There were still moves to make. Still avenues to explore. But the shape of the ending, whatever it would be, had begun to reveal itself. Not as a confession or a trial, but as an uneasy clarity. The kind that leaves no celebration, only a lingering awareness that the truth, once glimpsed, does not always come with the satisfaction of resolution. And somewhere, far from Queens, a man went about his life knowing that a story he thought had vanished into the noise of New York was being told again, slowly, carefully, by people who refused to let silence be the final word. Silence became the dominant sound of the investigation. Not the productive silence of waiting for results, but the heavy kind that settles in when all obvious moves have been made and none have delivered the certainty the law demands. The suspect had retreated behind legal walls. Evidence had been pushed as far as it could go without breaking. And yet, no one involved felt finished. The case had reached that uncomfortable middle ground where truth feels close enough to touch, but still refuses to solidify into something that can be held up in court. Behind the scenes, the strategy shifted again. If the case could not move forward directly, it would move sideways. Investigators stopped focusing on the suspect as a singular figure and started looking at the ripple effects of his life. People leave impressions even when they try not to. They create disturbances in the ordinary flow of things. Somewhere, someone had noticed something and dismissed it, just as so many others had over the years. They began contacting people from the margins of his past. Not co-workers or supervisors, but neighbors. Acquaintances. People who had lived near him briefly, shared walls, shared hallways, shared moments too small to register as important at the time. These interviews were different. Less formal. More conversational. Designed to let memory wander instead of forcing it down predetermined paths. One woman remembered him as polite, almost overly so. Always offering to help carry groceries. Always quick to explain himself when no explanation was needed. She recalled feeling uneasy, not because of anything he did, but because of how carefully he did everything. The way he watched reactions. The way he adjusted. She had brushed it off. People are allowed to be awkward. People are allowed to be strange. Another former neighbor recalled a night when police lights flashed outside their building. Not for him. For something else entirely. But he had been standing in the hallway, listening, too still, too attentive. When asked what he was doing, he had smiled and said he was just curious. Curious about what, he never said. These were impressions, not evidence. They couldn't be entered into reports as facts. But they shaped the narrative investigators were building in their heads, a narrative of someone who didn't act impulsively, who didn't explode or unravel, who observed and adapted and learned. Someone who understood systems not to break them, but to move through them unseen. The case returned, inevitably, to the building in Queens. Investigators stood once more in the stairwell, now cleaner, brighter, safer looking than it had been decades earlier. They imagined the night again, not as violence, but as procedure. A knock. A few words. A step inside. The door closing softly. No raised voices. No sudden movements. Just inevitability. That image haunted them, because it made the crime feel less like an aberration and more like an outcome. They consulted behavioral analysts, not to profile a killer, but to validate the shape of the case as it had evolved. The assessment was cautious but clear. This was not a crime of passion. Not an accident. Not an act of desperation. It bore the marks of someone comfortable with intrusion, comfortable with proximity, comfortable with silence. Someone who believed, correctly, that the aftermath would be louder than the act itself. As this understanding deepened, so did the frustration. Because the more deliberate the crime appeared, the less likely it was that the perpetrator had left behind anything usable. Care leaves fewer traces than chaos. Preparation erases opportunity for mistakes. And time, once again, had been the greatest accomplice. A breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A retired city employee, contacted as part of a broad sweep, mentioned a meeting years earlier about a safety review in the Queens area. During that meeting, a contractor had raised concerns about lock standards, arguing that certain models were misleading, that they could appear secure when they weren't. The argument had gone nowhere. Budgets were tight. The issue was tabled. The name of the contractor matched one that appeared in the suspect's employment history, overlapping in just the right year. It wasn't proof. It was alignment. Another piece clicking into a pattern that had been forming for years. Investigators felt the familiar rush, the dangerous one, the kind that tempts you to see meaning everywhere. They slowed themselves down. Checked. Verified. Cross-referenced. The alignment held. Still, when everything was laid out again, the conclusion remained the same. Compelling. Disturbing. Insufficient. The legal team was blunt. Without a confession, or a direct forensic link placing the suspect inside the apartment at the time of death, a case would likely collapse under its own weight. Defense attorneys thrive on time, on degraded evidence, on alternative explanations that can never be fully disproven. The truth, even if known, must survive skepticism. This one might not. The word closure began to surface in conversations, carefully, cautiously. Not as an outcome, but as a question. What does closure look like when justice is unreachable? Is it public acknowledgement? Is it an official statement? Is it a quiet understanding shared among those who've carried the burden longest? There were no good answers. Only compromises. The family was consulted again. Not informed, consulted. Their voices mattered now in a different way. They listened as detectives explained what they believed had happened, how, and why it could not be proven beyond doubt. It was the hardest conversation any of them had ever had. To hear the shape of the truth without the promise of accountability. To be asked, implicitly, how much certainty was enough. Grief doesn't react predictably. Some family members wanted names spoken out loud, regardless of consequence. Others feared reopening wounds without the protection of a trial. They argued. They cried. They remembered the person at the center of it all, the life that had been reduced to files and theories. In the end, they asked for honesty, even if it came without justice. The department faced its own reckoning. To leave the case officially open meant accepting perpetual failure. To close it without charges meant acknowledging limits. Neither option felt like a victory. But the title of a case is not its truth. It's an administrative decision, not a moral one. As preparations were made for a final review, detectives felt the weight of everything they couldn't change. The era. The technology. The small choices that had compounded into permanent gaps. They weren't haunted by what they'd missed. They were haunted by how easily it had all slipped away. Somewhere between the desire for resolution and the fear of finality, the case reached its quiet climax. Not with sirens or headlines, but with a decision made in a closed room, late in the evening, when the city outside had already moved on to tomorrow. The file would not tell the full story. It never could. But the people who knew it now understood something they hadn't before. That the absence of justice is not the absence of truth. And that sometimes, the most honest ending a case can offer is an acknowledgement of exactly how and why it failed to end at all. The decision didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with a hollow quiet, the kind that follows a long-held breath finally released. The case would be administratively closed. Not solved. Not cleared. Closed in the narrow, procedural sense that meant no further active investigation, unless something truly new emerged. It was a line drawn not through truth, but through exhaustion, resources, and the slow erosion of possibility. For the people in that room, it felt less like an ending and more like an admission. Paperwork moved faster than emotions. Forms were signed. Status fields updated. Databases reflected a change that words could not soften. The file was marked closed, even as everyone involved knew that nothing about the story felt finished. The phrase, "cold case closed," sounded definitive to outsiders, but inside the department, it carried a different meaning. It meant the city had reached the limit of what it could prove, not what it believed. The family was notified first. Not by email. Not by letter. In person, with care taken over every word. The explanation was careful, precise, stripped of euphemism. Investigators laid out the arc of the case as it now stood, the likely sequence of events, the reasons they could not proceed further. They spoke about standards of proof, about time, about evidence that no longer existed in usable form. They did not say the suspect's name aloud. They didn't need to. The family already knew. There was no shouting. No collapse. Just a deep, stunned stillness. Years of anticipation had trained them for disappointment, but finality hit differently. Hope can endure almost anything except certainty without justice. Some nodded. Some stared at the floor. One family member asked a question, so quiet it almost disappeared into the room. So he just gets to live his life. No one answered right away. There was no answer that didn't feel cruel. Outside that room, the city continued its rhythm, indifferent as ever. Trains ran. Sirens wailed for other reasons. Somewhere, people argued about things that would feel small in retrospect. The victim's name did not trend. There were no breaking news alerts. Closure, when it comes without spectacle, is easy to miss. Within the department, reactions varied. Some detectives felt relief, a release from a weight they had carried too long. Others felt anger, sharp and unresolved, directed not at any one person, but at the accumulation of missed chances. The youngest among them felt something closer to fear. A realization that not all effort leads to outcome, that some cases teach not how to win, but how to live with loss. The suspect was never informed officially. There was no requirement to. No charge. No case. And yet, something changed. Investigators noticed subtle shifts in his behavior once news of the closure leaked through informal channels. He became more visible. Less guarded. A man who had lived cautiously now seemed lighter, as if a tension he'd carried for decades had finally eased. That observation was never written down. It didn't belong in any report. The building in Queens received no acknowledgement. No plaque. No marker. The address remained what it had always been, a line of numbers on a street crowded with other lines of numbers. People passed through the doorway daily, carrying groceries, arguments, exhaustion, joy. None of them paused. None of them knew that a decision made miles away had just sealed the fate of a story tied forever to those walls. A few weeks later, an internal memo circulated, summarizing the case for archival purposes. It was clinical. Dates. Actions taken. Reasons for closure. It mentioned the lack of sufficient evidence. It did not mention the voicemail, or the way the suspect's voice caught when asked about it. It did not mention the lock, or how its design had quietly undermined assumptions for years. It did not mention the feeling in the room when everyone realized they were done not because they wanted to be, but because there was nowhere left to go. One detective, the same one who had reread the original report late at night so many times, printed a copy of the final memo and slipped it into the physical file. He paused before closing the folder, running a finger along the edge as if feeling for something hidden. Then he did something small and unofficial. He added a note. Not an accusation. Not a conclusion. Just a line meant for whoever might open the file again someday. Significant circumstantial convergence. Insufficient for prosecution. It wasn't much. But it was honest. Months passed. Life reasserted itself, as it always does. The case faded from daily conversation, then from memory. For most people, it became a sentence they might half recall if prompted. Wasn't there a case like that years ago? The details blurred. The fear softened. The city absorbed the story the way it absorbs everything else, grinding it down until only a faint outline remained. For the family, the absence took on a new shape. No longer waiting for updates, they began the harder work of deciding what the truth meant to them without validation from a courtroom. Some chose to believe fully in the investigators' conclusions. Others kept doubt alive, not because they disagreed, but because belief felt too much like surrender. They visited the grave. They told stories about who the victim had been before the case defined them. They tried, unevenly, to move forward. The suspect lived on. Quietly. Publicly. He aged. He adapted. The world changed around him in ways that would have made his crime, if committed later, nearly impossible to hide. Cameras multiplied. Data trails thickened. Doors grew smarter. But he had acted in a narrow window of history, when anonymity still existed in the seams of the city. That timing was not luck. It was opportunity, recognized and exploited. Years from now, a new investigator might stumble across the file, drawn in by the simplicity of the opening facts and the weight of the unanswered question. They might wonder why no one pushed harder, why the case stopped where it did. They might believe, briefly, that they could be the one to break it open. And maybe they would try. That possibility was never fully erased. It was just deferred. Because stories like this don't really end. They settle. They sink into the foundation of the places they happened, into the habits of the people who lived through them. They become part of the background noise, audible only if you know how to listen. And somewhere in that noise, beneath the official language and the closed status and the careful restraint of the law, the truth continued to exist exactly as it always had. Uncharged. Unconfessed. Unforgotten by those who mattered. Waiting, not for justice, but for acknowledgement, in a city that rarely looks back long enough to see what it has left behind. The first crack came from a place no one was watching anymore. It wasn't a tip. Not a confession. Not even a discovery. It was a routine digitization project, one of dozens running quietly across the city, meant to convert aging analog records into searchable archives before time erased them completely. Boxes were pulled from basements, shelves long ignored, labels faded to ghosts of ink. Most contained nothing of consequence. Parking violations. Noise complaints. Forgotten domestic disputes. The kind of paperwork history forgets for a reason. One box, mislabeled and misfiled decades earlier, carried a different weight. Inside were cassette tapes. Personal recordings seized during unrelated investigations in the early 2000s, catalogued loosely, many never reviewed again. The original case numbers no longer matched any active files. For years, they had been little more than magnetic plastic waiting to decay. But decay, as it turned out, had been slow. A junior archivist flagged one tape because of a technical anomaly. The audio quality was unusually high for its age, preserved better than others recorded around the same time. When transferred to digital, a voice emerged, steady, male, unhurried. It wasn't dramatic. No raised volume. No panic. Just someone speaking as if certain they would never need to explain themselves. The archivist didn't recognize the voice. But a phrase stood out. A specific phrase. An offhand remark about a door. About how people always assume locks mean safety. It was said casually, almost dismissively, like a joke shared with oneself. To most listeners, it would have meant nothing. But to anyone who had lived inside that closed case, it was a nerve struck directly. The archivist escalated the file, unsure why instinct told him to. Within hours, it reached a detective who had once worked the case as a rookie and never quite let it go. He listened once without reacting. Then again, slower. Then a third time, headphones pressed hard against his ears, eyes closed. He recognized the cadence. Not the voice exactly, time changes that, but the rhythm. The way the speaker paused before certain words. The confidence wrapped in restraint. It was the same pattern he remembered from an old interview transcript he had read years earlier, one he'd thought too much about since. The tape was dated 6 months after the murder. It had never been cross-referenced. By the next morning, the case file was reopened internally, not officially, not yet, but enough to authorize comparison. Audio samples were pulled from archived interviews. Algorithms did their work without emotion, measuring pitch, timing, micro-inflections. The result wasn't conclusive. It never was. But it was close enough to make silence impossible. Word spread carefully this time. No leaks. No memos. Just quiet meetings behind closed doors. The department had learned from before. If this was nothing, it would stay nothing. If it was something, it would be handled differently. The suspect was older now. Grayer. Slower. But not fragile. Surveillance confirmed what investigators suspected. He had grown comfortable. Predictable. Routine had replaced caution. He walked the same routes. Sat in the same cafe. Spoke to the same people, who knew him only as a man who had survived long enough to seem harmless. A decision was made. They wouldn't accuse him. Not yet. They wouldn't even mention the case. Instead, they would talk about the tape. An innocuous approach. Two detectives, unthreatening, requesting help identifying voices from old recordings tied to unrelated investigations. A standard process. Nothing to fear. No trap, at least not visibly. When they played the clip for him, his reaction was almost perfect. Almost. He smiled faintly. Shook his head. Said it didn't sound like him. Commented on how strange voices can seem when recorded. He even laughed, a soft exhale more than humor. For a moment, it looked like the end of the conversation. Then one detective asked a question that wasn't on the script. "Do you still believe that?" he said. "About locks?" The suspect didn't ask what he meant. That was the mistake. His eyes shifted, not away, but inward. A reflexive calculation. In that fraction of a second, decades of careful control slipped just enough to be noticed. When he answered, his voice was calm, but something underneath it hardened. "Believe what?" he said. The room went very still. The detectives didn't press. They didn't need to. The moment had already been recorded, catalogued, analyzed. Another data point. Another thread. Still not enough to charge. But enough to reopen everything that had been closed. This time, the case didn't feel exhausted. It felt awake. Outside, the city remained oblivious. No headlines. No alerts. Just a subtle shift in momentum that only a handful of people could sense. The kind that comes when a story thought finished begins, quietly, to breathe again. And somewhere between an old tape and a single unguarded reaction, the past leaned forward, closer than it had been in years, no longer content to stay buried. Momentum is a dangerous thing in a cold case. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It gathers silently, like pressure behind a wall that has learned to pretend it isn't cracking. And once it starts to move, everything that once felt settled begins to feel temporary. The reopened file grew thicker by the hour. Old evidence was pulled again, handled with gloves not just to preserve fingerprints, but to protect against the weight of hindsight. Photographs that had once seemed ordinary now carried a different gravity. Angles were reconsidered. Shadows re-examined. The crime scene, long frozen in grainy images, began to rearrange itself in the minds of investigators, not as it had been assumed, but as it might have truly unfolded. One detail refused to stay quiet. The door. It had always been there in the reports. Locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. A fact repeated so often it had become doctrine. The foundation of early conclusions. The reason certain suspects had been cleared without hesitation. But now, with that phrase echoing from the tape, People always assume locks mean safety. The door no longer felt like protection. It felt like staging. A specialist was brought in, someone with no emotional attachment to the case, no memory of its failures. She studied the lock mechanism, not the door itself, but its type, its wear, its history. The model had been discontinued years before the murder. Cheap. Common. Known for a flaw that rarely made it into official documentation. Under the right conditions, it could be locked from the outside. Not easily. Not accidentally. But deliberately. That single possibility sent a ripple through the room. It didn't rewrite the case, but it tilted it. Shifted the balance. Suddenly, timelines stretched. Movements once thought impossible became plausible. And the suspect, who had been quietly aging out of relevance, drifted back into the center of the frame. Investigators began reconstructing his life in the months following the murder, not looking for guilt, but for relief. The kind that leaks out after a danger has passed. Patterns emerged slowly. A sudden resignation from a job. A move that had never been fully explained. The sale of a car just weeks after the crime, cleaned thoroughly enough to feel excessive. None of it was illegal. All of it felt intentional. They interviewed people again. Friends. Co-workers. Neighbors. Many didn't remember much. Time had thinned their recollections into fragments. But fragments can cut sharper than full stories. One remembered a comment made in passing, something about how some people get away with things because no one wants to look too hard. Another recalled a night when the suspect had shown up unexpectedly, jittery, asking strange questions about police procedures. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it meant everything. The detectives worked without urgency, but with focus sharpened by restraint. They knew the danger of moving too fast. They also knew the danger of waiting too long. Evidence degrades. Memories rot. Suspects die. The suspect, meanwhile, seemed to sense the shift. Surveillance noted changes. His routines altered subtly. He skipped the cafe. Took longer routes home. Checked reflections more often. Not paranoia, awareness. The kind that comes from knowing something unfinished has stirred. When they brought him in again, it wasn't for interrogation. It was a conversation. Polite. Controlled. They spoke about the past in broad terms. About how cases linger. About how truth has a way of resurfacing. He listened carefully. Too carefully. When they mentioned the victim's name, his jaw tightened. Just slightly. Enough to register. Enough to confirm what the tape had suggested months earlier. This was someone who remembered more than he admitted. Still, he said nothing incriminating. He didn't need to. The pressure wasn't meant to break him yet. It was meant to remind him. To reopen doors he had closed in his own mind. To let the weight of years press down until silence became harder to maintain than confession. Outside the interview room, detectives watched through glass that reflected their own faces back at them, older now, more cautious, but no longer resigned. The case was no longer cold. It was simmering. And as night fell over the city, the victim's apartment, long since emptied, repainted, repurposed, seemed to reclaim its presence in the collective memory. A place where answers had been waiting all along, patient and quiet, ready for the moment someone finally learned how to listen. Silence can feel like safety until it starts to hum. In the days that followed the second interview, nothing happened publicly. No arrests. No statements. No leaks to the press. But inside the department, the air had changed. Conversations dropped when doors opened. Phones were answered in lower voices. Everyone understood that the case was no longer asking if, only when. The tape was played again. And again. This time not for what was said, but for what surrounded it. Background noise. A low-frequency sound buried beneath the voice, almost imperceptible unless you were listening for it. A rhythmic pulse. At first it had been dismissed as tape hiss, mechanical interference, nothing worth noting. But a sound engineer, brought in out of caution rather than hope, isolated it and slowed it down. What emerged wasn't random. It was a subway train. Not just any train. A specific line, identifiable by its braking pattern and tunnel acoustics. The kind of detail no one would ever notice unless they were trained to hear the city the way criminals do, through walls, through distance, through time. The location narrowed. A handful of stations. A stretch of track less than a mile long. And within that stretch, only one place where someone could sit, undisturbed, long enough to record a monologue without interruption. An abandoned maintenance room beneath a station that had been partially closed for renovations back in 2000. The same year as the murder. Records showed the suspect had access to that area. Temporary credentials issued for contract work. Legitimate. Clean. Forgotten. The kind of access that never raises alarms, because it's designed to blend in. Investigators returned to the room for the first time in decades. Dust coated everything. The air smelled like metal and damp concrete. But some things don't decay the way paper does. Scratches on the floor. A faint outline where equipment had once rested. And carved into the wall, shallow but deliberate, a mark that matched a symbol found in the victim's notebook, a doodle dismissed years ago as meaningless. It wasn't meaningless. It was a signature. Not meant to be found. Just meant to be left behind. The realization landed hard. This wasn't a crime of panic. Or impulse. It wasn't even rage. It was control. Planning layered so deeply that even mistakes were calculated. The lock. The timing. The tape. The long silence afterward. The suspect had never run, because he had never needed to. When they brought him in for the third time, the tone shifted. No small talk. No hypotheticals. The table was cleared except for a single photograph, the carving on the wall beneath the station, freshly taken, still dusted with debris. He stared at it longer than he should have. "Do you recognize this?" one detective asked. He didn't answer. "Because we do," another said. "And so does the victim." That did it. His composure didn't shatter. It fractured. A hairline break across a surface that had been polished for years. His breathing changed. Slightly faster. His hands, once folded neatly, separated. He asked for water. They gave it to him. Time slowed in that room, stretching every second into something heavier. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a countdown no one had started, but everyone could hear. He still didn't confess. But he didn't deny it either. Instead, he said something unexpected. "You're too late," he murmured. Not as a threat. As a statement of fact. Late for what? No one asked. Because some truths, once spoken, don't need clarification. The interrogation ended without resolution, but the damage was done. Whatever shield he had built around himself was thinning. Cracks spreading. The past was no longer behind him. It was standing in front of him now. And it wasn't finished. "You're too late." The words didn't echo in the room. They sank. No one challenged him. No one demanded an explanation. Detectives had learned, over years of interviews that went nowhere, that the most dangerous thing you can do after a statement like that is rush to fill the silence. Silence forces people to sit with what they've revealed. And what he had revealed, intentionally or not, was the idea of an ending already past. After he was released, the clock started moving faster. Not on the suspect. On the case. If too late meant evidence destroyed, witnesses gone, memories erased, then the window was closing. But if it meant something else, something unfinished, then the danger wasn't behind them. It was still active, still breathing somewhere in the city. Investigators split their focus. One team went backward, digging into what could no longer be recovered. Storage units emptied years ago. Electronics disposed of before digital footprints were common. Financial records that had aged out of retention. They mapped absences the way archaeologists map ruins, by what wasn't there anymore. Another team went forward. They examined everything the suspect had done after the murder. Not just the immediate months, but the decades that followed. Relationships formed and abandoned. Jobs taken and left. Addresses changed with no clear reason. Patterns didn't jump out at first. They rarely do when someone knows how to live invisibly. Then a name surfaced. A woman. Not connected to the victim. Not to the crime scene. Not even to the city at the time. She appeared briefly in the suspect's life 5 years after the murder. A short relationship. No drama. No police involvement. It ended quietly. Too quietly. When investigators found her, she was living 3 states away under a different last name. Married. Children. A life that looked sealed shut. She hesitated when they contacted her. Not out of fear, but recognition. She remembered him. She remembered the nights he couldn't sleep. The way he talked in fragments, as if finishing sentences in his head, but never out loud. She remembered how he once asked her a question that felt like a test. If someone disappeared, he had said, how long before people stopped looking? She had laughed at the time. Answered casually. Weeks. Months. Depends on who they are. He hadn't laughed back. She told detectives there was one night she never forgot. A night when he came home shaken, not drunk, not angry, just hollow. He had washed his hands repeatedly. Checked the locks twice. Then sat on the edge of the bed and said, almost to himself, they won't find it now. At the time, she hadn't known what it was. Now, decades later, the memory resurfaced like a bruise pressed too hard. Detectives asked her if she had ever been taken anywhere strange. Underground. Abandoned. Isolated. She nodded. Once. A maintenance corridor beneath a transit station, accessed through a door marked staff only. He had said it was a shortcut. A curiosity. Somewhere quiet. She said she remembered the smell. Metal. Dust. Cold air that felt untouched. She also remembered a mark on the wall. A symbol carved shallowly, like someone testing a blade. The same symbol. Search warrants followed. Not dramatic, not rushed. His current home. His storage locker. His digital footprint. What they found wasn't a smoking gun. It was worse. Order. Folders labeled meticulously. Dates. Locations. Newspaper clippings, not just of one case, but several. Murders. Disappearances. All unresolved. All with similarities no one had ever connected. The suspect had been collecting unsolved crimes. Studying them. Learning how people vanish without consequence. That was what too late meant. The case was no longer just about one victim. It was about the possibility that the silence hid more than anyone had ever imagined. And as detectives laid the evidence out across a long conference table, the weight of it settled in. This wasn't closure approaching. It was revelation. The kind that changes how a city understands its past and fears its future. Somewhere in the maze of subway tunnels beneath New York, trains thundered past, oblivious. Above ground, life moved forward. But beneath it all, something old and deliberate had left marks that time hadn't erased. And now, finally, they were being read. Once the idea takes hold that a single crime is not alone, it changes the temperature of every room it enters. What had once been a cold case became a node. A center point from which other silences began to radiate. Detectives no longer asked whether the suspect had done it. They asked how far the damage reached, and how many times the city had mistaken absence for peace. The clippings told a story without words. Different boroughs. Different years. Different victims. But the language was familiar. No sign of forced entry. No clear suspect. Last seen going about their normal routine. The phrases repeated like a chant, dulling the horror through repetition. Crimes that never earned headlines beyond a day. Disappearances that slowly slid off the page. Someone had been reading them closely. The suspect hadn't annotated the articles. No notes. No circles. No highlights. Just preservation. As if the act of keeping them intact mattered more than interpreting them. As if memory itself was the trophy. A profiler was brought in, not to label, but to listen. She didn't speak at first. She stood over the table, eyes moving slowly from clipping to clipping, hands clasped behind her back. When she finally turned, her voice was low. "This isn't obsession," she said. "It's curation." She explained that obsession is chaotic. Emotional. Messy. What lay before them was careful. Selective. Someone choosing which stories belonged together. Someone constructing a private archive of silence. The question shifted again. Not how many victims, but how many times had he been close. Transit records were pulled. Employment logs. Access points. Temporary passes. The suspect's life intersected with more places than anyone had realized. Maintenance jobs. Contract work. Short-term assignments that put him in and out of restricted spaces without permanence. Without notice. Invisible movement through the city's underlayer. Underground corridors. Service stairwells. Utility rooms that didn't exist on public maps. Places where no one expected witnesses, and no one asked questions. The city beneath the city. They mapped the crimes again, this time not by address, but by proximity to transit infrastructure. The pattern emerged slowly, like an image resolving through fog. Too slow to be coincidence. Too precise to be luck. Still, none of it crossed the line into certainty. Suspicion stacked high, but proof remained just out of reach. A lifetime spent avoiding mistakes had left little behind that could be held in court. Except one thing. Time. The suspect was aging faster now. Surveillance noted stiffness in his gait. Longer pauses before crossing streets. Doctor visits that had become more frequent. Mortality was no longer abstract. It was logistical. And people nearing the end behave differently. They start accounting for things. During the fourth interview, they didn't show him evidence. They showed him photographs. Not of victims. Of places. A stairwell beneath a station. A locked service door. A corridor with flaking paint and exposed wiring. Each image landed like a stone dropped into water. He said nothing. But his breathing changed. When they showed him the last photo, a close-up of a concrete wall marked by a familiar carved symbol, he finally looked up. "You found it," he said. Not a question. Not an apology. A recognition. The detectives waited. "You don't understand what you're looking at," he continued. "You think it's about them." He leaned back slightly, as if settling into something he had rehearsed. It was about time. They didn't interrupt. He spoke about the city as if it were alive. About movement and neglect. About how places forgotten by planners become perfect mirrors of people forgotten by society. He talked about how easily routine erases memory, how crowds are louder than screams, how permanence is an illusion built on assumption. Locks. Doors. Timetables. Systems people trust without ever testing. He stopped short of confession. Always stopped short. Words chosen carefully, like stepping stones across deep water. Enough to reveal his thinking. Never enough to place himself at the center. When the interview ended, one detective stayed behind, watching him through the glass as he was escorted out. The suspect didn't look back. He didn't need to. Outside, the investigation widened beyond him. New task forces formed quietly. Old cases re-examined with fresh criteria. Families contacted after years of silence, their hope stirred cautiously, painfully. Some didn't want answers anymore. Some had waited their entire lives. And then, without warning, the suspect collapsed. Not dramatically. No spectacle. Just a sudden failure of the body during a routine medical appointment. He was rushed to the hospital, unconscious, unstable. The word critical appeared in reports for the first time. A clock that had been ticking quietly was suddenly loud. Detectives gathered in hallways and offices, phones pressed to ears, voices urgent but controlled. If he died now, much of what he carried would die with him. Confessions lost. Locations unrevealed. Names swallowed by silence one final time. They requested access. At first, the hospital refused. Patient rights. Medical ethics. Procedure. Then the suspect woke up. Briefly. Just long enough to speak to one person. A nurse later described his expression as calm. Not afraid. Not confused. As if he had been waiting for the moment.